Stay up. Welcome to this evening with Sister Helen Prejean. My name's Tim Hicks. I direct the master's degree program in conflict and dispute resolution here at the law school. For those of you who don't know about that program, let me say just a few words about it. The law school houses a 2-year master's degree program, a graduate school degree program in conflict and dispute resolution as part of the ADR Center. And we're pretty proud of it. We think that it's fantastic that a law school includes the wide range of dispute resolution options, and we see ourselves as a family of dispute resolution engagers, from litigation all the way to mediation, and et cetera, et cetera. If you want to know more about the program, there's information on the table out front and my cards there, so you can always get in touch with me. So that's enough on that. But we're proud to be a part of one of the hosting organizations welcoming Sister Helen to UO. One of the purposes of Sister Helen's visit is to celebrate a good friend and colleague, both of hers and ours, whose day it is today. Cheney Ryan, who was... among many other things, was instrumental in the creation, the establishment of our master's program. Cheney has devoted much of his career to the study of peace and conflict, to justice and rights, and to war and peace. Among his many activities, I'm just going to list a few, and it goes back 30 years. But Cheney chaired the student faculty committee that created the University of Oregon Peace Studies program. He helped to found the Office of Multicultural Affairs. He was instrumental in the creation of our master's program, as I said, and the Carlton Savage Endowment in International Relations and Peace, the University of Oregon Humanities Center, the University of Oregon Schnitzer Program on Judaic Studies. The list does go on, believe me. He's really been a key figure, and as Jane Gordon, the director of the ADR Center, said at one point, if anything's happened in the last 30 years around peace studies, peace initiatives, peace and conflict issues, it's likely got Cheney Ryan's fingerprints on it somewhere. So that being the case, last year the master's program established an international essay contest in peace and conflict studies, and we began to think, we didn't have to think long, but we began to think, well, who shall we name this after? And we decided to name it after Cheney Ryan. So tonight we have the pleasure of announcing the first 3 winners. And we thought originally we were going to announce them March 1st, but we decided that this was really an opportune time to announce the 3 winners of this contest. What was I going to say next? So the contest drew submissions from all over the world, and we had 3 judges, a panel of 3 judges, to read the submissions. The challenge we gave the students was to write about this subject. It went like this: we know that psychological and social well-being are tied in significant ways to our sense of belonging, and that a key part of our identity is based on the groups to which we belong: our family, our community, our nation, our ethnic group, etc., etc. We also see how our national, ethnic, or religious identities can be the source of much destructive conflict. How can we reconcile this dilemma? How do we encourage the positive elements of group identity and at the same time avoid the perils of identity affiliations? So that was the charge that we gave students as we sent that out on the airways, inviting people to submit. Our judges this year were Cheney Ryan, Jennifer Reynolds, assistant professor at the law school, and Michael Moffitt, associate professor of law at the law school, associate director of the ADR Center, and associate dean at the law school. I want to thank each of the 3 of you. I see 2. Is Jen here? No, but it was really a wonderful piece of work that they did, and we look forward to many, many years of this Cheney Ryan International Essay Contest in Conflict and Peace Studies. Here to announce the winners and to introduce Sister Helen is Michael Moffitt.
The most typical way for a university professor to structure an assignment for students is to ask a question to which the professor imagines that he or she already knows the answer. And the topic selected for this essay contest was, as you probably noticed, immodest. Immodest enough that that one of the real pleasures of reading this year's essay contest entrance was that that virtually every one of those essays taught me something. And I think it's the hallmark of the very best in higher education, and frankly, probably in life, when the line between teacher and learner blurs. It was a real pleasure. We received essays from across the country and from 4 continents. And I'm pleased to announce that 3 students this year will be sharing in the Cheney Ryan Award. Jeff Stace from Goshen College, who wrote a paper called Mestizaje as Strength, Articulating Plurality Within Group Identities. Michael Cohen from Cornell University, who wrote a paper called Pluralism and Posterity, Extricating the Positives and Negatives of Group Identity through the writing of Amartya Sen and David Brooks. And Caleb Paul Meekum from Goshen College, who wrote the elegantly titled essay, Storytelling. These 3 students received word that they were the winners of this year's contest 4 hours ago. None of them is with us this evening, but our intention is to send them a recording of this evening's proceedings, and so I hope that you will join me in congratulating the 3 essay winners. And I now turn to the highlight of tonight's program, a collaboration on this campus that dates back a good number of years between the Savage Endowment for International Relations and Peace, the Clark Honors College, the Master's Program in Conflict and Dispute Resolution, and the Law School's Appropriate Dispute Resolution Center have combined forces to make this evening possible. And of course, we are delighted to welcome back to the university campus Sister Helen Prejean. This is a university campus, and on a campus like this, most of us who spend our lives here spend most of our years, and in fact, for many of us, a good chunk of our lives, hoping very much that one day we might be recognized for our passion and our contribution and our commitments. Frankly, we yearn to be welcomed home in our own academic disciplines. And of course, universities are carved up into departments and colleges and specialties, which means that one department's hero could walk through the halls of another department utterly unrecognized. And that is not so with Sister Helen. If this were the Department of Religion, Sister Helen would be welcomed home. Not just because she's a Catholic nun, but because she has done so much to mobilize diverse religious communities to action and to a deeper understanding of some of Christianity's deepest, hardest, and most important precepts. If we were in the Department of Communication and Journalism, Sister Helen would be welcomed home. There are very few examples better of the use of the media for what she describes as consciousness building than the collaborative efforts, the most widely known of which is Dead Man Walking. If we were in the Department of International Relations, Sister Helen would be welcomed home. There's a reason so many of her many honorary degrees come from schools around the world. Human rights have had very few people who are more dedicated spokespeople. If we were in the philosophy department, Sister Helen would be welcomed home. She is fluent in the works on forgiveness and retribution and redemption, and she invites others to wrestle with some of the most profound questions about the human experience. If we were in sociology department, Sister Helen would be welcomed home. Economic disparity, Racial inequality, geographically driven cultural differences are a central piece to the narrative of the death penalty. Her last time in Eugene, Sister Helen said, or at least my memory is, that you said something along the lines of, you don't have to start working on the death penalty. Just start working on poverty. You'll get there. Turns out we are in none of those places. We are in the law school. And I hope Sister Helen feels welcome here as well. She knows more than most in this building about the real-world effects of criminal procedure, about the constraints of bail and trial and appeals, and about the theories of justice embedded in our criminal justice system. I hope you will join me in welcoming Sister Helen Prejean to the University of Oregon. I hope you will join me in welcoming her home.
Oh. We want to welcome the people who are in room 110. We can't see you, but we know you're there. And we're talking to you just as if you were in here physically with us. Storytelling. I heard one time, I'd given a talk at the University of Notre Dame at the law school, and afterwards we all went to lunch, and the one who taught English and writing to the law students said, the one who tells the whole story wins the case. And about storytelling. And this has been something that's really gaining momentum in lawyers defending their clients of storytelling. There's stuff written on this now. How do you go and how do you tell the story of your client? In the case, for example, of Jeremy Gross, who went to a convenience store and in cold blood killed the convenience store owner and rifled through the cash register, and the video camera captured it. And as the man was dying, he's going, "Why, Jeremy, why?" And this kid is just firing into this innocent person. And so, the defense right away knew the prosecutor was going to show the video, of course. There's no doubt that Jeremy Gross was guilty. But the question comes up, well, should he live or should he die? And Bob Hill, his attorney, said to the jury, we've all seen the terrible thing that Jeffrey Gross did to that human being, that innocent human being, when he went in that convenience store. And now I want to tell the story of Jeremy Gross before he got to the convenience store and the story of his life and what may have led to the violence inside that young man that led him to take the life of another. When I walked out of the execution chamber, the first man that I witnessed killed by the state of Louisiana by electrocution. It was on the night of April the 4th. They waited till right after midnight on April the 5th. Done in the middle of the night. 1,900 volts of electricity passed through Patrick Saunier's body. And it had all been such a surprise to me that they actually would kill him. I had begun by writing a letter to a man on death row. And of course, that's a story in Dead Man Walking. When they killed him, he looked at my face. And we had discussed it. And he had said before, "Sister, you can't be there at the end because it could scar you for life to see something like this." And I looked in his eyes, and he's terrified, as I would be too. And I said to him, Patrick, I don't know what it's going to do to me. I've never done anything like this before. But you are not going to die alone without seeing a human face. And because he was Christian, I was Christian, I said, I'll be the face of Christ for you. You look at me when they do this. And he did. And it was that look and that event when I came out of the execution chamber that my mission was born. I vomited, I threw up, I'd never seen anything like this in my life. It's not like being with somebody in the hospital who's sick and fading and dying. Patrick was every bit as alive in our last hours in the death house as he was during all the visits over the 2.5 years. And they had killed him, and they had followed a protocol to kill him, and there was even a kind of politeness in the death house. Pat, you need anything? The psychiatrist, you want me to get you a Valium? There was a politeness. And one of the guards whispered to me, Sister, we're just doing our job. We're just doing our job. And I remember thinking there in the dark that night, coming out of that killing chamber, the American people are never going to see this. And I have reflected a lot on how the Holocaust happened and how the Third Reich moved and the Nuremberg laws that prepared the way for the German people themselves, many of them, as Jews were being driven through the streets of spitting on them and throwing stones on them and hating them. And the legalities always prepare the way. And so here I am, thrust into the middle of this, thank you, of the death penalty and watching it and being brought close up to it. And then the whole reflection on how is this happening? What is the mindset under it? And how are we as an American people doing this? And one of the reasons I wanted to write Dead Man Walking was that I gotta record the history. I gotta tell the story. There will come a day, we're beginning to see the diminishment in practice of the death penalty around the United States. I mean, even Texas, the biggest killing chamber in the United States, might have as many as 48 death sentences in a year, and last year had 8. And we can see the diminishment. We haven't had an execution in Louisiana in 8 years, except for a man just within the last month who gave up his appeals and chose to have the state kill him because he didn't want to go through it anymore. So what is a mindset under it that could enable a country like ours of good people that could say, yeah, I'm for the death penalty? And the percentages are still at 64%. On the up-down question, are you for the death penalty? People do this terrible crime. Are you for the death penalty? 64%. And so you have these fronts. You have the legal front that prepares the way. You have the religious front that prepares the way. And Martin Luther King said that. He wrote a book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And he said what kept slavery in place for so long was that some advanced scientific that really people of color were inferior to Caucasian people, and so it was only right and proper, and they enjoyed it more if they could just be the servants. But religion was in there too, and of course the laws. And standing outside that death chamber that night, I remember just thinking, but everybody thinks this is okay. And one of the things that made people think it was okay was it was a law. It was a law in Louisiana, it was a law in Georgia, it was a law then in 37 different states. The Supreme Court had said it was not against the Constitution. The Supreme Court of the United States, and we have reverence for law. So if law codifies it, it must be okay. And then religion, when I came out of that execution chamber that night, no religious leaders were protesting an execution. In fact, I was going to begin to have this very healthy, long-term dialogue with the Archbishop of New Orleans. I mean, you know, Willa Cather's story, death comes to the Archbishop. Well, this was death coming from the Archbishop because he had been in the military and he was all for the death penalty in Louisiana. And here I am coming out going, how are we going to bring the people? How do we awaken the people to change this? Because it's always about that, changing consciousness. And I don't know that he ever really, in principle, came around, but he retired. And and that helped. And in this, in the second book about accompanying two innocent people to execution, I talk about the religious dialogue with my own Catholic church. And Archbishop Hannon was part of it down in Louisiana, of upholding it and sending priests to trials to counter the testimonies of Jesuit priests from Loyola University, who at the sentencing part of the trial was saying to the Catholics on the jury, a lot of them, you don't want to be for the death penalty. In fact, the Catholic bishops of the United States, this is what they have said. And the district attorney was so upset with what the Jesuits were doing that he summoned the Archbishop Hannon, his friend, and said, this is what these Jesuits are doing. They're telling people in your jurisdiction that the bishops are saying they don't have to be for the death penalty. In good conscience, they can vote for life instead of death. What are you going to do about it? And Archbishop said, Archbishop, I think you should write a letter about establishing in your jurisdiction it's perfectly okay for Catholics on the jury to vote for the death penalty. And so sure enough, here we are at trials in New Orleans with the Catholic district attorney holding up the letter, reading the letter of their archbishop telling Catholics you can vote for the death penalty in good conscience. So the Catholic Church was all over the lot with the death penalty at first. I mean, we were not tightly wrapped and in principled opposition to the death penalty. There were so many loopholes. And so here I am. But I know what my eyes have seen. And when you have a direct witness, I'm sure the German people, if they had gone into the concentration camps, if they had seen with their own eyes the people starving, the people, if they had seen it with their eyes, surely they would see the evil of what was being done. But when you are removed from something, and when there's hatred and despising people in the air, those people, that distancing is what enables these things to happen. And I'm convinced of that, and it is still the case in this country. So the dialogue must begin. Who will be the witnesses? Who will be the ones sent? Who will be the ones to say, let us think about this? And we want to do an interfacing tonight between the death penalty and torture. My first teachers were Amnesty International, in which I learned about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was where I really had my founding and my first education. The first efforts in Louisiana were with Amnesty International, to get on the road, to begin to educate the people, to begin to have public witness so that we were not silent during executions, which meant we were complicit. And this had come through my own enlightenment and conversion about what religion was about, what the gospel of Jesus was about, what it means to really be a person that lives your faith. I thought it had all been about charity and being nice to people and kind and never being mean to anyone, but I didn't understand about justice. I didn't understand that you not only want to be kind to the individual, but you want to look at the system underneath it that's causing this suffering. And that's what human beings do, you know. That's what we do. That's what real intelligence is. You know, in real intelligence, in these little quiz kids that can just spout all this stuff in Trivial Pursuit and knowing facts about this river or that fact. The root meaning of intelligence is our capacity to see the relationships between things, the pattern between things. And the first lesson I learned from Amnesty, from Magdalena Rose Avila, who had been changed by Cesar Chavez. He had been a gun-toting, drug-pushing Mexican worker in Colorado, and he meets Cesar Chavez. And he was coming out bar after bar, having been in fights and doing the drug thing. And here's a man talking to people in the fields and organizing people, and he's standing on the other side of the ditch. He doesn't want to cross over, get too close like he looks like he's one of them. But he is listening to this man, Cesar Chavez, talking to people about their rights and what the pesticides were doing and how they had a right as human beings to join together. And he's changed. And now he's in the Southern Regional Office, Amnesty International. So when I do the phone call, come help us, please, in Louisiana, he's the one who comes. And then I begin to read. And it's a cardinal lesson. I'll never forget it. It was in one of the writings of Amnesty International. That human rights are inalienable human rights. And inalienable means that they can't be alienated from the person, and that they're not given by governments for good behavior and taken away for bad behavior. And there are two fundamental ones: the right to life, and then that no one shall be subjected to cruel and degrading punishment and torture. And I had watched Patrick, who was the first. I've accompanied 6 human beings, but he was the first. I had watched when the guards led him from the cell where he had waited in the death house 3 days. And I had watched as he was led, chained, hand and foot, leg irons on his legs, belt around his waist, handcuffs, surrounded by guards, and taken and strapped into the chair and killed, who's rendered defenseless. And Amnesty gave the working definition of torture. And that definition of torture, which is also in the UN Convention Against Torture, is that it is an extreme assault rendered on someone who is defenseless, an extreme mental assault or an extreme physical assault rendered on someone who has been made defenseless. And so that was the working premise. From a point of view of faith, and not only in Christianity, but in every spiritual tradition, it is that we are brothers and sisters to each other. And that we should treat one another as we'd have others treat us. And you know, these sassy little bumper stickers started appearing. They probably originated in Oregon, because y'all originate a lot of this stuff. Those who are churchgoers here, I mean, I know that you're not known for going to church. But boy, are you known for human rights and civil rights and care of the earth and probably every progressive thing. But this little bumper stick would appear. I think when Jesus said, love your enemy, that did not include killing them. And sassy little things like that. But the root of every spiritual tradition is that we are brothers and sisters to one another. And so I began first about learning about human rights, and then about learning how to tell the story and to bring people there. And I found that when I would go into audiences and begin by talking about human rights of the person being executed in the climate, in the culture of Louisiana, people didn't want to hear it. Don't talk to me about their human rights and how much this guy suffered being executed. Look what he did to his victims. And you never won. You never could move out of it. They were locked into this victim thing. And Jason Epstein, who was my editor, that helped me shape this book, told me when I brought the first draft into his office at Random House in New York, and he looked at it, he said, you wait too long to talk about the crime. You're a Roman Catholic nun, you're a spiritual advisor to this murderer, and people aren't going to read this book because they're going to think you're overly sympathetic to the guy. Oh, he's a child of God, pat, pat, pat on the wrist. Oh, I know he shouldn't have done it, but you got to be unblinking about the crime in the first 10 pages of this book and the horror of what happens when innocent people are ripped out of life by violence. And in this case, it was 2 teenage kids. And he said, then on every page of this book, you hold that tension of horror at the crime, but then you're increasing horror as you recognize what it means for the state of Louisiana to kill an alive human being and what happens in that process. And that's the task of the book. And later I found out that William Faulkner had said when he got the Nobel Prize for Literature, the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. And the conflict in my heart was, of course, here I met the murderer, and then I heard about the victims. And they were two beautiful, innocent teenage kids. And so my own journey then, after making the mistake of not reaching out to them because I didn't think, well, I thought they're not going to want to see me. I'm the spiritual advisor, the one who killed their kids. And then when I met them, the surprise. Yes, one of the girls' parents were very angry at me and have remained angry at me. But the boy's parents, and he says to me, Lord, LeBlanc's son David had been killed. Sister, where you been? All this time we had nobody to talk to. You can't believe the pressure on us for the death penalty. And I didn't know victims' families wanted any kind of pressure. I thought offered the death penalty, they would be the first to say, yeah, it's what we want. And he was my first teacher, and he's the hero of this book. I end the book with him. Because the path that he went on was the path that showed that if he gave in to the violence, the way he put it was, I tried to go there, sister. I tried to go there. I tried to hate those fellows that killed our son. And he said, but I didn't like the way it made me feel. And I said to myself, I always have been a kind person. I like to help people. And then I'm having these feelings of hatred, and I want to see him die. And then I said, they killed our son, but I'm not going to let them kill me. I'm going to do what Jesus said. And he began to walk down the path of forgiveness, which is a path, it's not an act. And know that in this diminishment of the death penalty we have going on in the country now, and the repealing of the death penalty 2 years ago in New Jersey, and the repealing of the death penalty in New Mexico, and the 11 states where repeal bills are now being surfaced and moved forward. It has been the witness of victims' families saying before those legislative bodies, 62 of them in New Jersey, 70 of them in New Mexico, don't kill for us. And who can gainsay their witness? Because politicians, faced with the pain of a family, knowing they haven't gone through the pain, how dare they not say they're going to be for the death penalty in face of this victim's pain? And they have legitimized the death penalty, and you can hear it in the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, look at this family. They will never see their grandchildren. Justice means nothing less than the death penalty, or you will dishonor their dead loved one. It's built into the symbolism of what it means to value human life and what equal justice means. And because they didn't value life or the human rights of their victims, why should we value theirs? And so without the victim's voices to say, watching another person's child be killed is not going to heal me. And testimony after testimony after testimony of sharing, their pain. One father in Kansas, when they were thinking of putting it back, when he testified, he talked about his little daughter who was 5 years old. It was one of those horrible things. The child was kidnapped and brutally murdered, and he never saw his child alive again. I mean, what greater pain can a father have? And he comes with his stumbling words and his tears before this legislative committee to tell them that when he would walk with his little daughter down the sidewalk, and if there was a bug, she'd say, Daddy, don't step on the bug. And he said, how can I honor her life? She so respected life that she respected the life of bugs. How can I honor her? By asking that a human being be killed in her name. So I began to learn about human rights, and I learned the two cardinal ones of the right to life, which Eleanor Roosevelt, she had a huge role in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So right away now, this is 1948, they say, except in the case, Article 3, except in the case of people who have been lawfully condemned to die for their crimes. And Eleanor Roosevelt says, no. We want it to be universal human rights. And we can't start universal human rights by making an exception. So she held out And then that no one will be treated and subjected to cruel and degrading punishment and torture. Torture. We don't have a Supreme Court that acknowledges torture. And believe me, I never in my life thought I'd get into all of this stuff about how you read the Constitution. Justice Scalia, who goes duck hunting with my brother Louis in Louisiana and represents a fierce, originalist reading of the Constitution, that what the framers said was okay is what we must do. And the only way to change it is legislatively. So we cannot reinterpret cruel and unusual punishment. We can't use what we've learned in psychology. We can't use what we know in PTSD. We can't use what we know about the brains of young people and how they develop, and that juveniles shouldn't get the death penalty. He was a dissent when the Supreme Court voted not to kill juveniles. He was a dissent when the Supreme Court voted not to kill the mentally impaired. He looked up the 18th century definition of idiot and said, the framers said it was fine. I mean, they know right from wrong. Everybody has a free will in God's grace. Don't tell me they're poor. Don't tell me they're mentally retarded. Don't tell me they're kids. They fit the bill. They pay for the crime. Compassion hardly has a chance, but just even justice. And you know, it's always been about the crime, but culpability for the crime. Not just what's the crime, but who did the crime. And so there's just refusal to acknowledge that cruel and unusual punishment in our growing understanding of it and understanding of it around the world. Another thing that happened, and happened in the Rehnquist court, was to take each of those constitutional protections and pare them down so that they became almost impossible for people to access. The right to a good attorney, Strickland decision. They made it so hard that for 18 years they never heard a case about ineffectiveness of assistance. They said, we settled that. And the criteria was, you had to show that the lawyer was so ineffective that that was the reason that the jury voted for death. And who could prove that kind of causality and connection? Race on juries, the McCleskey decision, they had not just on juries, but in application of the death penalty. It's so clear. You want to look at the working pattern. They had said only choose the worst of the worst murderers. Well, everybody's going worst of the worst. Not your ordinary murders. Not your garden variety murders. Only your worst of the worst murders. People going worst of the worst, worst of the worst. But in practice, we know what it means. And we have the track record now of 34 years of practice in this, and we know what worst of the worst means in practice. 8 out of every 10 people executed, 8 out of every 10 people on death row. Who'd you kill? Where is it a white person who's the victim? Or a person of color who's the victim? Does it matter? You better believe it matters. 8 out of every 10 people chosen for death, it's because they kill white people. And when people of color are killed in my own city, 90% of all of the violence and murders are people of color. Many of black people killing other black people, or Mexican Americans who've come into New Orleans now for the rebuilding. And the death penalty is seldom, if ever, pursued for the death of a person of color. Unless it's a black policeman, maybe a whole family. It's overwhelming what the practice means, because if life isn't valued, there's not going to be outrage over every death. And race and poverty, it's all in there. So here's the Supreme Court saying, and so far this has held, that they can't find the reason in the Constitution per se to wipe the death penalty out. If they had different ears to hear, and eyes to see, and hearts to understand, they would know that the very reason that they overturned the death penalty in Furman in 72 for the arbitrariness and capriciousness and disproportionate way it is applied to the poor and minorities exists in the United States today, but they never go and look on the ground to see how the thing's being practiced. I read once about Brandeis, that he'd actually go on the ground, go see how this thing was practiced in real life. It was a labor thing about people in a factory. He said, let's go see what's going on here. And I was pleased to read that Sonia Sotomayor is very interested in the facts in the lower level of the case. People like Justice Scalia says, we don't look at facts at this level. We're not interested in facts at this level. Just the procedures and where you're supposed to be when you come in. So how do you apply the death penalty over and over in application after application and make the constraints, even for innocence in the Herrera decision, even for innocence? So I don't know if you followed what happened with Troy Davis in Georgia. Did anybody follow this case? You know about it. Here's a kid, a black guy in Georgia, who was sentenced to death on Georgia's death row, and there were 9 eyewitnesses at the trial that pointed to Troy Davis and said he had killed the person. Now, 7 of the 9 have recanted, saying they were forced by the police, they were coerced in all these ways. 7 out of the 9 have recanted. But the big question is, can they get a hearing in a federal court? Because it's too late. Because of the time factor. All these procedures come in, the time factor. And the court heard it, thank God, and voted 7-2 that yes, Troy Davis, because it's so palpable, the evidence that he may be innocent, that yes, it is definitely against the Constitution for an innocent person to be executed. Which is really good. And there were 2 dissents. And we know who they are. They always vote together, like little clones. And it was Scalia and Clarence Thomas. And the dissent was so brutal. I got a letter from a man who said, would you please write a note to my grandchildren about what justice means? I am so horrified by what this justice said, because what he said was, the Constitution does not allow, nor have we ever held, that even after here's a big presumption, full and fair trial, even though someone can show probable innocence, that he has a right to hearing in a court. And it was so cold and brutal and out there, like even showing probable innocence. We got to follow the procedures. We got to follow the procedures. This book, in the second part, I talk about Justice Scalia and the way the Constitution's being interpreted. And I have a quote from Jesus about lawyers swallowing gnats. No. Missing the gnats, but swallowing the camels and neglecting the weightier issues of justice and mercy. How do you interpret a Constitution? And Justice Scalia said, well, I'll just read the text. And I think, what did the framers have in mind? Consult a dictionary if you need to. That's what we do. And if we do anything else, that's judicial activism. Is Nelson Mandela going to read the word justice in the same way that Justice Antonin Scalia, who graduated from Georgetown, is going to read the word justice? When you come to reading a text, and you find that this kind of fundamentalism in approaching a text of Constitution, of course, applies to the Bible. And boy, when you have those 2 things together like that. So I descended to this world where these human beings are being put to death, 3 by electrocution, 3 by lethal injection. The guards involved in it, who practice for it, who have to be prepared to do their deed that night, and they practice with a guard of the same size and the same height and the same weight as the one they're going to take that night and kill. And they practice when he goes peacefully, and they practice when he resists them every inch of the way. And I see torture. I see the people on death row that I have known sharing that everyone has the same nightmare. Because you can control your consciousness while you're awake. But when you dream, you cannot control. And the same nightmare, they're coming for me. It's my time. And I'm fighting and I'm screaming and kicking, going, no, no. And then I wake up and I look around and I'm in my cell. And I went, oh, it's just a dream. When Patrick Saunier went into the death house 3 days before he was to be killed, he wouldn't sleep. He was scared to go to sleep because he couldn't control his dreams. Conscious, imaginative human beings sentenced to death anticipate their dying, imagine their dying, and die 1,000 times inside their mind before they die. Those that I have accompanied when it did come to the end, where they are making the walk, there was like a sense of relief. It's going to be over. Sister, just pray God holds up my legs as I make that last walk. Is the death penalty torture? Who can acknowledge that it is torture? Not to mention putting human beings in confined spaces like a 6.5 foot by 9 foot cell for 20 years, 15 years, 18 years. But when your criteria is, look what they did to their victim, then none of this seems to matter, because that's the standard, that's the value. Oh, measure against what they did to their victim as to what we should be able to do to them. So we've lost our own compass, and we're measuring it against them. And when you look at it from one level, it's like we are using people's worst behavior that human beings can do and using it as our standards, and we imitate them in trying to find a solution to this. You kill, we're going to kill you. We're going to do it politely. We're going to do it with a protocol. And it was watching that protocol at the end that made me think of what happened in Germany. Because, I mean, the way they serve the media, you know, the finger sandwiches and the cookies and the refreshments, and they're waiting to come in and do their part. The witnesses who are coming in, they're all polite. They're in another place. Everybody is so polite in this and following the protocol exactly. That's really what made me think a lot about Germany and what had happened to people. Torture. UN Convention Against Torture is very clear that mental torture is as real as physical torture. And an extreme assault, an extreme mental assault. What's an extreme mental assault? Well, we moved from our death houses here into Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and what has gone on there. I believe that we have tilled the soil for torture on our own home turf with the death penalty, and so it's just a short leap of Alberto Gonzalez, who would meet with Governor George Bush the morning of an execution for 15 minutes to thoroughly review the case, and within 15 minutes, check, approve 152 executions in Texas. And now, as the Attorney General of the United States, and we have these, well, not prisoners of war in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. We have enemy combatants, and here we see what happens when you bring in the lawyers. You change the terms and you change the rules. The Geneva Conventions don't apply to enemy combatants. They apply to prisoners of war, and these people are not prisoners of war. And so all of it came out. The stress positions in which people would be tied or hung. And I have a friend, Denny LaBeouf, who has worked on capital cases in Louisiana and has been part of the ACLU project, the John Adams Project, to take the clients and defendants in Guantanamo. And they have won a great victory over time, and it was hard. But they have dropped capital charges against the 5 clients that they were representing in the John Adams Project. And a huge victory that it would not be military tribunals who would try them, but that they would have a federal court to be able to hear their cases. That was huge, and it was nip and tuck. But she said, what we heard about Guantanamo and what really has gone on there, she said, the stories are so terrible that of what we did to human beings. And see, what's the mindset of the people who participate? In the man, he had shackled by his hands and he was an amputee. And so he could only stand on one leg, and would bring in a doctor to measure the swollenness of the leg that had been amputated, of the stump of it, to see what stage the swelling would have to be at, where there could be a rupture of blood vessels, and so to release him from the stress position in which they held him. It's unbelievable what we did. Of the torture, and when we heard of it, when we saw the pictures of Abu Ghraib, when we saw the degradation, and now some of the stories have begun to come out about the very people who participated in the torture of people in those places. And the shame, and how you get caught in the current, and how you think, well, the higher-ups are saying that we can do this, and everybody has great leeway. And then you hear Justice Scalia, this interview that he did with the BBC in England about 9 months ago. And they're talking about the enhanced interrogation methods and the waterboarding and all the things that we have done to human beings. And they're saying, well, Justice Scalia, you're on the Supreme Court of the United States. Don't you have the 8th Amendment against cruelty, against torture to people, cruel and unusual punishment? And Justice Scalia said, punishment? We're not talking about punishment. Punishment is for people who have been to trial and been convicted. We're talking about interrogation of someone who may have information that can save a whole city. And he said, do whatever you need to do. Drive things under their fingernails, or do whatever you need to do to get that information. What happens to a mind and a heart and a way that you begin to interpret things so that this cruelty against people who've been rendered defenseless? I believe it's because we have been killing human beings. Over 1,100 of them. We have electrocuted people and shot people, hung people, gassed people. And then we have lethal injection that's supposed to look like a humane death. And it's why when we were doing the film of Dead Man Walking, 6 weeks into writing the film, Tim Robbins called me up and he said, believe me, as a filmmaker, I hate to lose this image of the electric chair because it clearly shows you're killing a person. But he said more and more states are turning to lethal injection. And we can't let people cut any moral corners. We got to bring them into it. We're going to have someone in the film who's guilty. It's not a question of an innocent person. They're definitely guilty. And we're going to put lethal injection because that's a humane way to kill a human being. And the human beings I have been with who tried to prepare to die with dignity, when they round the corner with the guards and they face either a chair or a lethal injection gurney, do you think it really makes a big difference? And then the more you know about lethal injection, the 3 drugs, a short barbiturate to put people to sleep, short acting. The real killer is the potassium chloride, which is like a fire that goes through your body and then hits your heart, traumatizes your heart and stops it. Why have they used the second drug? Pancuronium bromide. It's to paralyze the person being killed. So they can't lift a finger. They can't cry out if anything's gone wrong. And in the testimonies they had from veterinarians about why they don't use that drug when they put animals down, because they say we can't see if they're in pain, and we paralyze them. And during the hearings before the Supreme Court, you know, you had, well, why do you paralyze them? And the answer, well, it's for their dignity, Your Honor. Like it's against their dignity for them to be, you know, thrashing on the gurney. They should go out quietly for their dignity, Your Honor, and for the witnesses, Your Honor. And there you have it. We don't really want to look like we're killing people. We don't want witnesses. Just a few people. I mean, 12. I mean, that was the realization. People are never going to see this. We're never going to make this public. It's going to be a secret ritual until we finally get rid of it. Because to have people see this, to be brought close. C. Paul Phelps, who was the head of the Department of Corrections in Louisiana, and I were talking one time, he said, you know, before an execution, when people hear about the crime the person did, he said, I got a line of people clean across the Mississippi River saying they'll be glad to witness. They'll be glad to pull a switch or do whatever. And after the execution, very few of them asked to come back. Because when you watch the killing of a human being before your eyes, they were alive, and then they're dead, and then there's a body bag, and then there's the ambulance taking them out. Then there's the formulaic death. Then there's the warden speaking to the press. Only certain questions. The press fell right into it. What was the last meal? What were his last words? Louisiana, the meal's a big thing. Did he have fried shrimp or what, you know? But it's the people, it's us, the people. How do we awaken the people that this is unworthy of us and that this has so much to do with us? What happens to the guards who have to be the ones who do the killing for us? And I tell the story here of the supervisor, Captain Felton Cootie, who was the supervisor on death row in Louisiana. And I think he could have done his job his whole life until he retired, because he's bringing the people their food, he's keeping order on the tier. But then he got moved to the TAC unit. Then he got moved to the ones who carry it out. And his job wasn't even to strap them on the gurney. His job was to go into their cell after they had been killed with a little paper sack and collect their clothes and their toothbrush and their personal belongings to give to their family after their death. And he called me into his office. And he said, Sister, I've been through five. And I come home afterwards. And I can't sleep and I can't eat. I get in my lazy boy chair, stay there all night. And I can't do it anymore. And he's the only one I met in the whole system of death who quit his job because of his conscience. And it can be so hard for people because jobs are hard to come by and they have a family. But the stories are beginning to come out now. Warden Willett, who was the one, he was the first trigger to the deaths of 100 people in Texas. Their signal is you take off your glasses, the executioner sees it, and the person's killed. 1, after 10, after 20, after 30, after 50, after human beings killed, all legal, all according to the law, all with a popular support in a way. And you know, I've been asked many times, you know, when I've been in Europe, why are the American people so wedded to violence and vengeance and the death penalty? Why? I mean, you know, the rapid understanding about human rights has really progressed around the world. 40 years ago, only 20 countries didn't have the death penalty. And now, it's the majority of the 190-something nations of the world. What is it about the American people, they ask me, that makes them so wedded to the death penalty? And here's the discovery. crisscrossing this nation many, many times. People aren't wedded to it at all. They never think about it. We're not a highly reflective culture. Now, Oregon, I know, y'all are outdoors more and you reflect more. And even out of a philosophy department comes peace studies and, practical things that have to do with embodying peace. Not every philosophy department in the country ever gives rise to something so beautifully practical as an embodiment of doing conflict resolution and peace studies that comes out of the philosophy department. But here in Oregon it did. At least at this university it did. So the way social change has always happened is that we have to change the consciousness of the people. We ourselves have to be directly involved in some way to learn. And of course, not everybody, you have a death row, but you are not serious about the death penalty in Oregon. How many people on death row in Oregon? 32. How many people have you killed in the last 34 years of practice? 2. And they were both volunteers. That's too many, of course, because each life is a universe. But in the southern states where 80% of the executions go on, the real practitioners of death have always been the 10 southern states where slavery was practiced. The penal code has always been harsher, and punishment has always been harsher. And so the ultimate punishment has always been harsher. But Oregon, what would it take to repeal the death penalty in Oregon and get it off the books? And you say, well, we got so many needs, man, we can't just be working on this death penalty thing. It only affects a few people. And the very heart and all the wounds of our country are in this. The death penalty is not a peripheral moral issue about what to do about with a few terrible criminals. Racism's in it. Assault on the poor, it's only poor people who go to death row. And our penchant for trying to solve social problems through violence. They committed violence, we committed violence. And then to say to the victim's family, and you get to watch, and it will heal you. It will give you justice. Hopefully you won't have to wait 15, 20 years. I've been in the execution chamber in Texas for the death of James Aldridge. And there are 3 witnessing chambers there. The state's witnesses looking down on the gurney, one-way glass, can't see them, everybody anonymous. In the other, the victim's family, finally given their moment of justice. And in the other is where the mother stands with her hand against that glass, looking down into the face of her child as the state kills her child. There's another funeral. There's another grieving family. We are a people of life. And we are a people of justice, and our Constitution was written, and we have high ideals and equal justice carved into the marble on the Supreme Court. But it's we the people who wake up and begin to act for justice that make it come alive. And let me just say, in ending here, that my books will be there for you tonight. I'll be happy to sign them for you. It goes into the Ministry Against the Death Penalty. And you can get both of the books for $25. You get one, it's for $15. If you make out a check, it's to Sisters of St. Joseph. And we'd be happy to receive your contributions for our work. I feel like I'm being stalked. Thank you.